Hello, young scholars. Welcome to another podcast on various topics in AP World and European history. And as you see today, we'll be taking a look at the scientific revolution. Now, we will want to, before we get into the scientific revolution, which mostly occurs in the 16th, 17th, and even into the early 18th century, we will want to remember that which came before. Medieval science, such as it was, which was largely based on the work of Aristotle. You will remember us discussing gentlemen like St. Thomas Aquinas and the Scholastics, who were quite fascinated by Aristotle's work, particularly after it had been brought back in as a result of contact with the Muslim world, and we acknowledged in previous class discussions, that sort of thing, that the Dar al-Islam as well in the post-classical period made its own set of contributions to the scientific learning of the time in terms of medicine and astronomy and so forth and so on. Now, that is not, of course, to say that all science in, say, the Middle Ages in Europe was entirely based on these Greek guys that had been dead for over 1,000 years. That is certainly not the case. They do, in the Middle Ages, begin to develop things like optics for eyeglasses, and certainly mathematics and engineering. A number of advancements had to be made over previous classical understanding in order to construct the castles and the cathedrals that we think of as being perhaps the most obvious physical symbols of the medieval European presence. More to the point, we also need to look perhaps to the Renaissance as laying some of the intellectual framework for this scientific revolution to occur. We discussed the fact that, first of all, the study of the human body, which is initially largely for artistic purposes, enhances humanity's understanding of our sort of internal functioning. You may remember Da Vinci's painting of the Vitruvian Man. You may remember the Baroque piece that we looked at of the anatomy lesson of Dr. Culp by Rembrandt, and certainly the fact that the increasing encouragement that Renaissance humanists are going to give to questioning, to seeking out new forms of knowledge, definitely going to pave the way significantly here. So, all of that said, what is the scientific revolution? Well, it really begins in the mid-1500s, and most crucially, it is going to rely on reason and observation to make sense of the physical universe. That is to say that, as opposed to, say, the medieval period, where scholars were willing to assume that some of the great thinkers that had gone before were just plain right, and that's all there was to it, or perhaps to rely on teachings of the church. A lot of these new scientific thinkers are going to say, okay, well, first of all, any conclusion that we draw has to be logical. It has to make sense. It cannot rely on faith. It cannot rely on superstition. It cannot rely on tradition. It's got to make logical sense. It has to come from a place that is very explainable. And further, it needs to be something that we can observe. We need to be able to physically see some kind of see or smell or touch some kind of demonstration of these principles that we believe are at work. And to that end, we are going to see that these scientific thinkers are going to try very hard, and in many cases be very, very successful, at putting the world in a sort of mathematical way. This revolution cannot be divorced in any sense from mathematics and from philosophy. Many of these gentlemen are going to see all three of those as sort of going hand in hand. But the most important thing that you want to remember is, unlike previous thinkers, the emphasis, the sort of ultimate emphasis that's being placed here on both reason and observation, going to be absolutely crucial and going to represent something of a shift in thinking for some of these individuals. Now, the scientific revolution is really going to kick off particularly in astronomy. And that is in part because first of all, it is a field of study that can be observed relatively easily, I suppose, at least on a basic level. You go outside at night, you look up at the stars, and there it is. But also, many of these astronomers start out by working at least in part as astrologers. We need to remember in this period that things that we today would consider to be pseudoscience or plain not science at all, like alchemy or astrology, these thinkers do not see those distinctions. And so, for them, understanding the movement of the stars, that they may be in some way trying to use that to sort of make astrological predictions, that kind of thing. And along the way, in some cases, they either also find or perhaps even stumble onto what we would consider more crucial scientific discoveries. Now, even though we've discussed sort of ad nauseum the fact that people knew, educated people at least, knew that the Earth was round prior to the voyages of Columbus, throughout the Middle Ages and even in the early Renaissance, they did believe in the geocentric theory of one of the Greek thinkers, Ptolemy, which was that the Earth was at the center of the universe, and that all of the various heavenly bodies, the sun, moon, etc., revolved around the Earth. Now, this does make a certain amount of sense when you think about it. I mean, the planet or the sun and the moon rise in more or less the same place every day. Obviously, that changes over the course of the seasons. And even comets make semi-regular appearances if you are around long enough to see them sort of come back. But in the 1540s, a gentleman named Nicholas Copernicus was making a series of observations for astrological purposes, and he began to realize that the position of various stars and that sort of thing was differing at different times of year. And this is the point at which he started to realize that Earth essentially could not possibly be a resting body. There's no way that Earth is standing still and that everything is just strictly revolving around us, because if that was the case, then all these stars would be in the exact same position relative to each other all the time. And so he began to realize that the Earth was moving around something, and he proposed in 1543 a heliocentric theory, which means that the planets and other sort of celestial bodies were in fact revolving around the sun. And this was quite radical, and he actually did not publish this while he was alive. He had it published posthumously because he recognized that it was a radical notion, that it was going to upset a number of individuals in the Catholic Church, which the Church as a body had ascribed to the geocentric theory. And obviously, when you question the nature of the universe, particularly in this period when philosophy and science were so closely connected to religion, when you question the nature of the universe, there's also some implicit questioning about the nature of man, the nature of God, that can potentially go on there, and that, of course, can be divisive. Now, it did not end there. And there were a number of individuals who became interested in Copernicus's work. One of them being a gentleman named Tycho Brahe, who actually went out and collected data that served to support Copernicus's theory. So again, we have that notion of reason and observation. Nicholas Copernicus says, this geocentric theory that we have is simply not a very good explanation of all the facts. I think heliocentrism is a better one, because it just makes sense that if these things are moving in this way and these angles are changing, that is what must be going on. Tycho Brahe then follows up by saying, okay, let me observe these movements that Copernicus talks about. Let me look at them over and over and over and over and over, and let's see if we can determine for certain that this is in fact the case, which obviously he did. He was then followed up by a gentleman named Johannes Kepler, who used Brahe's data to calculate the orbits of planets mathematically, and moreover to prove that these orbits were not even circular, but elliptical. And then finally, sort of the perhaps the best known of all of these astronomers, Galileo Galilei, an Italian, who, well, is perhaps best known for perfecting the telescope and therefore actually looking into the night sky with a much deeper gaze than anyone previous. He identified various celestial bodies that had not been found before, and made different observations about them. There's also a lot of stories that he spent a lot of time looking at the sun, which was terrible for his eyesight. But through his perfecting of the telescope, he was able to make further supportive observations and basically say, yep, these past three astronomers, Copernicus, Brahe, Kepler, they've all been right. And he was actually, in some cases, pretty loud about pointing out that they were right. And obviously, he was an Italian and living in Italy, where the Roman Catholic Church still had a great deal of sway. And he got himself rather into trouble with the Roman Catholic Church. He was arrested. He was brought in for questioning and a sort of trial. And eventually, he was essentially told, you need to recant your statements regarding this heliocentrism and everything, or you're going to be sent before the Inquisition and tried as a heretic. And as we have discussed in class, to be sent before the Inquisition meant, at best, probably a number of very unpleasant torturing experiences being placed upon you, and at worst, torture plus death. So Galileo did in fact end up recanting, and spent the rest of much of the rest of his days under house arrest as a result. The Roman Catholic Church said, okay, we're not going to kill you, but we're also not going to just cut you loose. Now, before though we go thinking about Galileo as this sort of this man who sort of stood up to tradition, stood up to ignorance, if you want to call it that, stood up to this older way of looking at things, and this sort of great liberator. We need to remember that he was very much an elitist. He actually, in a number of his correspondence, basically said, well, common people are uneducated, they're stupid, they're superstitious, and therefore we shouldn't even bother trying to tell them all this stuff, because they just won't get it. They can't. They're not ready. And so all this knowledge should be reserved for those of us who have the intelligence, who have the educational background, who have the chutzpah and the gravitas to sort of understand it, and so forth and so on. So, interesting guy. But the problem is, what the Catholic Church would call a problem is, by the time Galileo recants and goes into house arrest, the cat is very much out of the bag. And so by this point, people are going to start taking this notion of looking at the world rationally, and attempting to prove these new principles and establish this new understanding through observation. They're going to run with it. And the notion is going to start spreading north and west into Western Europe, where in some cases, in part due to Protestantism, in part due to the decreased influence of the Catholic Church over the legal system, people are going to have a little bit freer hand to sort of experiment with all this new learning and this new way of looking at the world. And to that end, we're going to have two scientists, one English, one French, and that it would be Francis Bacon and René Descartes, respectively, who are going to take it a step further by saying that science doesn't have to explain the physical world in a way that goes along with the church at all. It is entirely possible that the church is just wrong. It is entirely possible that the church is backward, is too rooted in superstition, and that we have to sort of reject the teachings of the church altogether in order to come to a true understanding. And to that end, they are going to both sort of independently start developing what we now call the scientific method. The idea that, okay, I have this assertion that I think might be the case, it's rational, it's logical. I am then going to develop, hopefully, some kind of controlled experiment in order to test these various assertions that I have and see if they can be proven to be true through the recording of data that will produce a consistent result. Now, we need to keep in mind that even though we think of these men as scientists, that they are not necessarily strictly scientific. As I pointed out earlier, many of these men also saw themselves as philosophers, as mathematicians. Some of them engaged in alchemy. René Descartes, in particular, did a lot of thinking about what we now refer to as metaphysics, and talked a lot about the notion that he believed that the mind sort of existed in a separate plane from the physical body. Francis Bacon, incidentally, in addition to his scientific work, was also a novelist. He sat as an MP in Parliament for a time. He actually was the Lord Chancellor for a while under James I, and eventually actually fell into debt and got himself into a great deal of trouble and was sort of brought up on corruption charges and kicked out by Parliament, incidentally, which is kind of fun. Anyway, all that to say, these men were also sort of taking this notion of the scientific method and beginning to apply it to other fields of study as well. In many ways, this scientific revolution for a lot of these guys is going to become something of a lifestyle. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Now, so Descartes also is a gentleman who's really going to emphasize the use of mathematics in science, and he is actually relatively well known in the mathematics world as well. Anything that you see that has to do with Descartes, either his mathematical work or his scientific work, is going to be referred to as Cartesian. So when people talk about Cartesian philosophy, Cartesian mathematics, they're talking about Descartes. And that has to do with the way that his name is Latinized, because a lot of the writing is still being done in Latin, a lot of the official sort of scientific writing, because that's the language of the educated in Europe. Descartes also argued that the ability to reason, the ability to think rationally, was the defining characteristic of humans. It is what separates us from the beasts, so to say. He also said, "I think, therefore I am," which is probably his most famous quote. He's a little bit of a tabula rasa guy. Now, tabula rasa is going to most closely be associated with Sir John Locke a little bit later. This notion that sort of humans are born as a blank slate, and that anything that we learn or achieve beyond that is the result of our experiences and those we come into contact with and so forth. Descartes is certainly not there, but in a sense he's headed in that direction. Also, even though we talked about the fact that his name had been Latinized, Descartes did publish much of his work in French, which was seen as quite scandalous at the time. To publish your work in the vernacular was, well, it's okay for poetry. We talked about the fact that literature has been published in the vernacular for a couple hundred years. People like Dante Alighieri with the Divine Comedy, Chaucer with Canterbury Tales, and so forth and so on. But the idea that scientific correspondence will be published in the vernacular was seen as just absolute crazy talk, and so it was quite scandalous. Now, we cannot go further without discussing Sir Isaac Newton. Sir Isaac Newton is in many ways a sort of late scientific revolution thinker, but he, as he said himself, I have seen so far because I stood on the shoulders of giants. Much of his work relies on things that came before, but he is revolutionary, and he is huge. His influence cannot be underestimated. He is still considered to be one of the greatest physicists of all time. So, in 1687, he writes a sort of a short book, The Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy, which argues that all of nature follows uniform laws and that motion can be measured and described mathematically. For most of my students, of course, will not have taken physics up to this point. However, I'm sure many of you are familiar with basic laws of Newtonian physics, such as an object at rest tends to stay at rest, An object in motion tends to stay in motion, and so forth and so on, right? These basic mathematical formulas, mathematical equations, numbers that we use to articulate the way things move about in the universe. And he lays all this out in this book. This is perhaps one of the ultimate realizations of this scientific revolutionary system of thinking, right? The world, which traditionally, well, why do things move? Well, they just do. It moved because I dropped it, and that's just what happens. However you want to put it. Isaac Newton says, yes, that's true, but there's more to it than that. And through observation, through experimentation, and through rational thinking, he says, there's a way that we can mathematically describe how all of these things work. We can boil it all down to numbers. We can forget any notion about the interference of God into any of these events. It's all math. It's all numbers. It's all just stuff that naturally happens. The universe behaves in a rational way. And again, his work was revolutionary. He also is associated with discovering the idea of the force of gravity. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with the story of the apple falling and him going, oh yeah, gravity. And so he is one of the ones who develops the notion that the force of gravity actually keeps the planets in orbit. He is also considered by many to be the father of calculus as well, which is required for sort of more advanced mathematical calculations. So he's definitely a big math guy to boot. Isaac Newton, I will also add, was phenomenally famous in Britain during his own time. He actually served, amongst other things, he served as an official for the Royal Mint for a while. He was involved in government. He played around with prisms and talked about the reflection of light. He sat on the Royal Society for Science. He was quite the man about town. He was quite well known. And when he died, his death was mourned by nearly everyone. The English poet Alexander Pope wrote an epitaph for him. Voltaire, who happened to be in London at the time of his death, talked about it. He was way famous. His contributions to science were recognized instantly for their importance, for being as revolutionary as they were. Okay, other scientific thinkers during this period that we just will want to mention. First of all, Robert Boyle, who chiefly was involved in chemistry. And distinguished the idea of an element, a chemical element, from the idea of a compound. Also, the field of medicine is evolving a great deal during this period. I believe I've mentioned to my students before the phenomenon of roving womb syndrome. So certainly, medicine is very much in a state of flux during this period. They certainly are not aware of germ theory, but they are beginning to have a deeper understanding of the human body. Ambrose Parr is going to start trying to come up with new ways of stitching up wounds to prevent infections. William Harvey was doing an analysis of the body that led to him being able to explain the way in which the blood circulated. Anthony von Leeuwenhoek also perfects the microscope and was one of the first people to see a human cell. So even though they're certainly, by our standards, these doctors still had a long way to go, there's a lot of stuff that they are beginning to see that is going to really drastically influence the way that medicine is being practiced. In fact, this is the first period during which we actually have doctors starting to become licensed. You don't just sort of apprentice yourself to a potion maker of some kind, or to the wise old woman, and then just start passing things out to everybody. Most of our surgeons, who coincidentally are also mostly barbers, are going to start actually spending more time going to what we would consider an actual school or a college of medicine, getting themselves educated, and making sure that they have some sort of a certificate that demonstrates that they are indeed capable of doing the kind of work that they're being asked to do. Okay, so as a result of the scientific revolution, a lot of things are going to change. Number one, we have a huge increase in the amount of discourse that's going on over science. Obviously, some of this is being helped by the development of the printing press, because that means that when somebody publishes a paper describing the laws of motion or the circulation of blood in the body, we can print up a bajillion copies of it. We can then ship those copies out transnationally, in fact, so we can get them across borders. And as a result, a lot of these scientists start actually sharing their information with each other. It's not just I'm going to sit here in my little town and work on stuff, and you're going to sit in your town 200 miles away. We're never going to see each other or talk to each other. They start communicating in some cases quite regularly. We know that Isaac Newton, for example, carried on relatively long correspondence with a man in Switzerland. We know that if we get into sort of our Enlightenment philosophers, who again were sometimes also involved in this mathematical stuff. We have Voltaire from France corresponding with Frederick the Great of Prussia, and so forth and so on. And this is part of what results in the establishing what's called the Republic of Science. Unlike the field of politics, which was very dominated by the notion of nationality and competition and Machiavellianism and all that sort of stuff, many of these scientists, while they're certainly in some cases sort of competing with each other and trying to get to the discovery first, they're operating in a very cooperative, egalitarian, pluralistic kind of way. There's a lot of information sharing, there's a lot of communicating, and a lot of just sort of sharing their excitement. This is also the period during which the Atlantic economy has grown to the point that we're beginning to get coffee houses in Europe. And particularly for my students who read History of the World in 6 classes, you remember them discussing the ways in which the availability of coffee and later tea are going to sort of encourage this scientific discourse. They're going to encourage people to be able to wake up, to be able to think more clearly, to go to these coffee houses and communicate and share knowledge and so forth and so on. This is particularly going to be the case in the upper classes in England. Again, I mentioned that Francis Bacon was an MP. I mentioned that Isaac Newton was also well-to-do and had a role in the government. And particularly in England, they are really going to embrace this scientific revolution. Let's look at the world rationally. Let's be more efficient. Let's escape from our own sort of superstitions or belief in sort of supernatural influences and magic. Let's find a rational explanation. They're really into that stuff, to the point that in 1662, Charles II is going to establish the Royal Society of London for Improving Natural Knowledge, which will subsequently just be called the Royal Society of London. And it is, in a sense, a government-sponsored organization whose job it is to sort of seek out this knowledge. So it really is going to be quite popular in England, and it is very much going to establish a culture of rationalism because of the success that these scientists are going to have in applying reason to the motion of the celestial bodies and all that sort of thing. A number of these European thinkers are going to say, we can take this notion of reason and this scientific style thinking and rationalism and experimentation, and we can apply that to anything. We can apply it to sociology, we can apply it to politics, to history, to medicine, to music even. And we'll talk about this more in a minute, but it really is going to lead to kind of a revolution in the way that Europeans look at the world. We look, for example, at the music of this period of the Enlightenment. As music theory develops, people are getting more and more interested in the science of how this music works. So yes, it sounds good, but it must sound good for a reason. So they really start thinking about chords and chord progressions and the way these notes fit together. And as a result, you get music by people like Mozart, which is very pretty. But part of what's so pretty about it is the fact that it is extremely regular. That your meters that they're composing in are almost always in groupings of two, and all of your phrases are these nice, convenient sort of 4-bar phrases that feel very complete, that always sort of resolve chord-wise. And of course, this scientific revolution is also really going to set the stage for the European Enlightenment, at which point thinkers like Locke, Rousseau, Voltaire are going to start saying, let's look at the world rationally. Let's stop focusing on obeying this monarch simply because God tells us to. Let's stop seeing the government as the Leviathan described by Hobbes, where the government is just here to sort of like keep everybody under control. Let's start thinking of the government as a way to ensure our liberty, so that people will have the opportunity to examine the world for themselves, to make themselves better. And really that could not happen without the scientific revolution, because the Enlightenment is basically just the second phase of the scientific revolution being naturally applied to other fields of study, and in particular the realm of sort of sociology and politics. Okay, another on a very practical level that we're going to see is the agricultural revolution that is going to follow the scientific revolution. And again, this starts in England primarily because in England they are very, very willing to accept this new way of looking at the world in the upper classes. We talked about the fact that Isaac Newton in his own time is incredibly famous. I mean, he's treated almost sort of like this intellectual demigod. So in England, in the 17th and 18th century, a couple of things start happening. First of all, they start experimenting with new ways of getting more yield out of the same amount of space for crops. They start crop rotating instead of using the old 3-field system. You remember in the Middle Ages we said, okay, we have 3 fields, we farm wheat on one, we farm some kind of a bean on the other that we think will regenerate the nutrients in the soil, and we leave one fallow just to recover. Well, in this period, they actually just go back to basically a back and forth system. We plant wheat one year, we plant beans the next, we plant wheat the next year, we plant beans the next, and so that way 30% of our fields are never just laying there doing nothing. So they're actually getting higher yield out of that field or out of that land because they're using more of the fields at once. In order to sort of account for the fact that they're getting less sort of regenerating of the soil, they're also going to start using fertilizer during this period, right? So again, we're starting to not only come up with something that's more efficient, with something that's more rational, but we are also scientifically thinking about ways that we can modify the environment to make it produce more effectively. Now, here's the real kicker. There's also something that happens during this period called the enclosure movement. Now, remember, these old medieval rural communities, these manors, if you recall from our discussion of the Middle Ages, that land was largely worked communally. You have a group of peasants living on the manor, and each family has their own individual plots, but there's also some land that they work together for the lord. And then there's also an amount of land in the village that's called common land, or the commons, that could be used by the common people, could be used by anybody. So, for example, if you had a pair of cows, you might let them graze on the commons rather than letting them just like trample all over your crops. And so, even though there is a certain amount of, okay, this family works this piece and this family works this piece, the land is very much being shared by the community. Well, here's the downside to the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the saying that if you're going to make an omelet, you have to break some eggs. And if you are going to build a brave new world, that means something has to happen to the old world that you lived in. So a lot of these landlords who are being heavily influenced by this scientific rationalism and this notion that, hey, let's go out and change the world, let's make it better, let's come up with the thing that makes the most sense, with the thing that's the most efficient. They're going to say, this old system that we have of these peasants using our land and giving us a percentage of their crop, using this old three-field system and having this wasted common land that's not really producing anything for me, the landlord, that's very inefficient. It doesn't work very well. So what they're going to do is they're going to get a series of bills passed in Parliament, and remember, Parliament, even the House of Commons, is generally full of relatively well-to-do people who own some kind of property. They're going to get a series of bills pushed through Parliament that are going to say that these lords are allowed to enclose the common land, to literally surround it with a fence or a stone wall and prevent other people from using it. And so in some cases, they're actually just going to straight up kick some of these peasant families off of their land and say, well, I don't need tenants anymore. What I need are laborers. So what you can do is you can come work for me, and you can work the land, and I'll pay you wages. But you don't just like have this land that you can live on anymore. And by the way, since I'm now using fertilizer and these new crop rotation systems and messing around with selective breeding of animals so that I get bigger, better cattle and fatter pigs and so forth, or sheep that produce more wool, I don't need as many of you peasants anymore as I used to. And since I'm finding that certain cash crops, like potentially raising sheep and harvesting their wool, is more profitable than taking a percentage of your rents as peasants, I'm also going to be not growing food. Instead, I'm going to be growing this other stuff that's going to make me more money. So the result is a much more efficient agricultural system, because these landlords are willing to experiment with these new techniques and new methods and so forth. But it's going to really, really hurt the lower classes in rural areas. A lot of peasants are going to find themselves jobless and homeless, kicked off of their land. And remember that in England, not only have we now removed this sort of communal village environment where, hey, we're all going to work the land together, and if you have a bad year, we've still got like this common land to help you out, and we can all kind of chip in, like we're a community here, we're going to work together. Now, we've gotten rid of that. But remember, previously under Henry VIII, we also got rid of all of the monasteries. So a lot of the so-called social safety nets that these peasants had to rely on now no longer existed. And so many of them are going to start drifting into the cities looking for work. And this, by the way, is going to be one of the things that's going to set up the that's going to set up the Industrial Revolution, because suddenly all of these entrepreneurs who are in these cities who want to build, eventually build what are going to become factories, have this vast supply of poor labor that they can draw from. Anyway, I digress. Getting back to this agricultural revolution, the enclosure, the crop rotation, the fertilizer, the selective breeding of animals, by 1700, England's agricultural productivity is going to be 2.5 times that of France, which is remarkable considering that England is a much smaller country. And so because of that, these new agricultural techniques are going to start spreading into northern France and into parts of the Netherlands and a few other places. And we're going to have, particularly in France, these groups of physiocrats who are going to say, hey, this stuff is really, really cool. We need to jump on the bandwagon here and sort of get involved in this because there's a lot of money to be made, and it will increase our agricultural productivity, which will just mean that everybody is better off. And so, for example, they are going to also argue that we need to get rid of mercantilism, because if we open things up, if we allow for more free trade, people will be able to be more productive. And again, this is largely going to benefit the wealthy. Now, of course, in Eastern Europe and Russia, very little change. Most of this stuff is not really going to make it there until much later, if at all. And, in Eastern Russia or in Eastern Europe and Russia, we're still very much relying on serfdom. The last thing that I will share with you, just because it's kind of fun, is this sort of common poem from, or a rhyme, I should say, from the era that I'm talking about here. When all this land is being enclosed. And you see here a map. This is what it sort of would have looked like before. You've got the common land, these little village little houses sort of around the perimeter, and then you have the various fields that are being worked around that. Anyway, so the rhyme goes like this, and this is the sort of peasants and lower classes complaining about the fact that their common land is being essentially stripped from them by these landlords. The law locks up both man and common, or pardon. The law locks up both man and woman who steals the goose from off the common, but lets the greater felon loose who steals the common from the goose. And so we do need to keep in mind that because of this remarkable shift in thinking that's happening in the educated European upper classes, they are really paving the way for some incredibly remarkable changes that are then going to fuel what is going to happen in the 19th century in Europe, both in terms of the Industrial Revolution, but also in terms of what's going to happen in France with the French Revolution and the subsequent sort of development of modernity, if we want to call it that. And in one of my favorite quotes from the film Jurassic Park, I will leave you with this. Life finds a way. Life evolves, it breaks through barriers, and sometimes painfully. And so one of the things that we need to bear in mind is, with all of this change, it is going to lead to some incredibly remarkable discoveries. It is going to improve the quality of human life dramatically. It's going to lead to this new Enlightenment outlook, which is going to encourage greater personal freedom and sort of the evolution of political thought. But it is also going to set the stage for some really, really terrible things that are going to happen as humanity evolves into this new way of looking at the world. And I will leave you with that. Thanks, and I will be back with you guys at some point later.